Hi, my name is Adri and welcome back to the Lazy Arts channel where I share my journey of sewing my own wardrobe. In this video I will show you how I made this cute button-up dress from a thrifted bedsheet and a slightly hacked self-directed pattern, so you can make it too. I made the pattern from Jess Dang's vintage dress tutorial, but it didn't have a sleeve, so the main hack is adding the sleeve to the dress, and because of this I had to change the pattern a bit, so I will show you how I did that. You can find Jess's vintage dress tutorial video in the description along with the usual timestamps. Here you can see the usual project summary. I spent around $5 on the fabric and the buttons, and I spent a total of 12 hours working on this project. And without further ado, let's jump into the pattern drafting.
I will start with the side front bodice piece. First, I'm going to draw a rectangle with the size of 1/8 of my bust measurement plus ½ centimeter, and with the length that I want for the bodice, which is the distance between the top of the bodice I measured at my upper bust and to my waist. Then I measure the height of my under bust from the waist and I draw a dashed line, and I do the same with the distance measured from my waist to my bust line. Then from the left line I measure 1/8 of my upper bust measurement. Then on the under bust line I measure 1/8 of my under bust plus ½ centimeter, and on the waistline I measure 1/8 of my waist measurement plus 1.5 centimeters. Then I connect all the dots with lines, and then I draw a freehand curve around these lines. Then from the upper bust line I measure down the distance to the armpit, and I connect it with the upper bust point, and I make another slightly curved line for the armhole. Then from the inner waist point I measure back 1/8 of my waist measurement, and then I connect this point with the armhole point. Then you should check the lines that we made, that they are around 1/8 of your measurements that you took, just to be safe. Then I add 1 centimeter seam allowance all around the sewing pattern, and I cut it out. And of course I don't forget to name the pattern, and I also note we will cut 2 mirror from the main fabric and 2 mirror from the lining fabric. Next I make the front center bodice piece. For this I draw 2 perpendicular lines, and I grab my side front pattern and align it with the 2 lines so that the waist touches the horizontal line and the armhole point touches the vertical line. Then I trace the princess seam side, and I measure up 3 centimeters from the armhole point. This will be the point of my cleavage. I connect this point with the upper bust point and make a slightly curved line, and then I measure out perpendicularly 4.5 centimeters to make button and buttonhole placket. This is 1.5 times the size of the placket that I want at the end. I cut it out too, and then I name it just as I did with the side front piece. Next, for the back pattern piece, again I draw a perpendicular lines and fit the side front bodice piece to the lines in a way that I mirror the side seam to the back pattern piece, as well as the armhole curve. I also mark the points of the waist and the bust line. Then I made a dart using these measurements, copying the distance from the vertical line to the other side of the dart and making the other dart leg. My paper wasn't wide enough, so I taped on another piece, and then I went on with the horizontal line. Then I measured 1/8 of my waist measurement from the dart leg, but then I realized that this is wrong. For one, I didn't consider that I already had 2 centimeter seam allowance in the side front piece that made the whole thing bigger. And another is that my whole back bodice piece should be 1/4 of my bust measurement, so I remeasured this point, made a vertical line at this point, and then I remeasured the dart so that on both sides I had 1/8 of my waist measurement plus 1 centimeter on the side for seam allowance, and then I redrew the dart legs. For the center upper point of the back bodice piece I used the height of the center front piece button placket. I drew a line from this point to the armhole point and made a slightly curved line, and I also marked that I will have to cut this piece on the fold with on the center back of the pattern piece. Now all that was left is a pocket pattern piece, so I grabbed an A4 paper and I made a 15 by 26 centimeter rectangle, and then I made a curved line from another 15 centimeter point from the corner, and this is the pocket piece, and you have to cut it 2 times mirrored from your main fabric and 2 times mirrored from your lining fabric if you don't have enough main fabric, as I do at this project. Now let's get on to the cutting. I worked with 100% cotton fabric that I thrifted, and it was 130 centimeters wide and 200 centimeters long, and I folded it in half lengthwise. First I cut off 60 centimeters for the sleeves, and then I cut the rest in half for the back and front skirt parts, so each was 70 centimeters long and 130 centimeters wide. I had an additional fabric tube that I could use for the bodice parts, so I started with folding up a part for the back bodice piece. By tracing the back bodice, I also marked the place of the darts, the dart legs and the dart point. Small tip I figured out by doing this, that I pinned a pin to the top of the dart so I could trace it to the other side of the bodice too, because it was folded. Then from the rest of the fabric I could only fit the front side pieces, so I traced it as well and then cut it out from the fabric. For the rest of the bodice pieces and the back pocket pieces, I had to use a part of one of the skirt pieces, so I folded up a section that would fit the front center bodice piece and consequently the pocket pieces too. At some point of the tracing and the cutting process, I usually pin together the 2 layers of fabric so they don't slip from each other, but I have a whole video about how I'm cutting my patterns from the fabric, so you can check that out for further information. After cutting out the bodice and the pocket, I cut the skirt part even, and then I cut it in half because I decided this will be the front skirt piece, so I needed 2 pieces that I can connect with the buttons at the center. I decided to trim the buttonhole area on every piece because I didn't want to deal with the bulkiness. Then I went back to the 60 centimeter long piece that I've cut off at the beginning. I folded the piece twice lengthwise, and then at the non-folded part I measured up around 2 centimeters and then made a slightly curved line that will be the bottom of the sleeve. Then I measured the elastic I want to use at the shoulder. I measured it twice, but it's enough to measure it once on your fabric, so I made a mark. I've matched my side front bodice piece to the mark and to the edge of the sleeve, and I've raised the curve of the side bodice piece so the sleeve will fit into it snugly. Then I mirrored the side bodice piece on the mark I made for the elastic to make sure that the folding will fit to the sloped line of the side bodice piece, and then I cut the whole thing out. At this point I was ready with the main fabric pieces, and I also cut out the bodice pieces and 2 of the pocket pieces from the lining fabric I chose. Okay, so on to sewing. I started with assembling the bodice. First I like to do the darts, so I started out with the back bodice piece. I used a sewing hack I learned on Instagram for pinning the darts together, so I pinned a pin through the dart legs horizontally all along the dart, and then I pushed the fabric together on the pin to fold the dart essentially, and then I pinned down the pins into the fabric, securing the dart this way for the sewing. I always sew from the dart leg to the dart point, and at the beginning I always backstitch, but at the end, as I go along the dart mark, at the end I don't do backstitching. I just thread off the material and doing a few stitches after I came off the material, and then I cut the thread with a longer tail and do a double knot at the end of the dart. This way it won't be pointy. Next I pin together the front and side bodice pieces by matching up the curved sides with right sides facing each other and pinning all along the edge. I sew along this edge with a normal straight stitch and my 1 centimeter seam allowance I made at the pattern drafting. After this you can piece together the front and back pieces at the side seam, so align the back piece and the side front piece with the right sides facing each other, pin them together and sew along the edge, again with the 1 centimeter seam allowance and the normal straight stitch. Do these steps for the lining pieces too, and then you have your main bodice pieces. And now we can go to the ironing board. First I press the seam allowance open, and then I press the start on both ends and on the lining and on the main fabric too. Then to the seam of the center and side bodice pieces, I use, well, in this case, a ball of socks to iron it a bit curved to maintain the curved shape of the bodice piece here, because it will go to my chest, and this way it will preserve this curveness more. Now I like to do my ironing in batches, so I move on to the sleeve, and here I iron the top folded part where the elastic will go. So I fold this part down, iron it, and then fold it again, because this is how I will reach the curved part that I traced from the side bodice piece. So I cut down this corner sticking out from the folded part, and then I go to the sewing machine and sew down the edge of this folded part. After doing this to both sleeves, I fold it wrong side out together at the side seam of the sleeve, and I pin it, and then I sew it with my normal 1 centimeter seam allowance and a straight stitch. Then I overlocked the edge of this seam, but you can finish it with a zigzag stitch too. Then I inserted the elastic by pinning a safety pin to one end of it and threading it through the tunnel I made with the folding. I wanted the elastic to go from around 10 centimeters after the front curve to 10 centimeters before the back curve. So I made marks there, and then I stubbed the elastic and pinned it to the fabric when I reached this first 10 centimeter mark, and then I threaded it all the way through and took out the safety pin because I wouldn't be able to do it after, and then I carefully let it fall back to the back mark I made for the elastic, and I pinned that end too, and then I sewed the ends with straight stitches, going back and forth a few times so it will hold. A quick note for this elastic part, that if you think that you made it gathered enough, then make it a little bit even more gathered, because it's a little bit loose on my shoulder right now, and at some point I will probably tighten it up so it's more gathered and stays more securely on my shoulder. So I would suggest that you make it more secure at the first time. Once this is ready, I attach the sleeve to the main bodice, and I do this by matching up the side seam of the bodice piece to the bottom seam of the sleeve, and I match them right sides together. Then I pin the whole thing together, and I pay attention to align the end of the sleeve in a way that it horizontally cuts the pointy part of the bodice, as I show you in the video, because it will lay more nicely this way, and then sew the armholes with the usual seam allowance and the normal straight stitch. Once this is done, we get back to the main bodice part, and now we will enclose the raw edges of the sleeve attachment and the whole bodice by attaching the lining to the main fabric with right sides together. So I match up the seams and pin the whole upper part of the bodice together with the lining. Please pay attention to leave 7 centimeters unattached and unsewed at both ends of the bodice, because we will need this for the button and buttonhole plackets in a later step. Then sew along the whole edge, leaving out these 7 centimeters at both ends. After sewing the two layers together, I trimmed the seam allowance and made an understitch at the lining part. So I folded the seam allowance towards the lining, spread out the two layers, and make a stitch about 2 or 3 millimeters away from the seam at the lining part to prevent the lining from rolling out to the visible side of the garment. Then for the 7 centimeters that you left out, make a snip at the edge of the sewn and unsewn part, so you will be able to fold it, and then make a fold of 1 centimeter towards the lining of the fabric, and then fold the remaining part in half towards the main fabric of the bodice, and sew at the 1 centimeter seam allowance at the top of this folded up part. Then after sewing, you can trim the seam allowance, especially at the corner, and fold it out, pushing the corner out with a dull object like a chopstick, and then you have your button or buttonhole placket, and you have to repeat this whole process at the other side of the bodice where we left out the other 7 centimeters. Now our bodice is all ready and we can move on to the skirt. First, I attach my main fabric pocket pieces to the back skirt piece, placing them 7 centimeters away from the top edge of the skirt piece, pinning them right sides together, And I repeat the same for the front skirt pieces. With the pocket pieces I cut out from the lining. I always do this if I don't have enough main fabric material, because the front pocket pieces will never be visible on the finished garment. And then sewing with the usual 1 centimeter seam allowance. At this point I want to mention that it's easier to finish the curved and bottom edge of the pocket pieces while they are still unattached to the skirt, so you may finish them now before attaching them to the skirt with a zigzag stitch or an overlocker. Then I overlocked the sides of the skirt pieces where I sewed the pockets. You can make a zigzag stitch here. Then I pressed the pocket pieces away from the fabric like this and made an understitching on the front pocket pieces made from the lining. And then I laid my front skirt pieces to the back piece, right sides together, matching up the pocket pieces. Pay attention to sew along the curve of the pockets, leaving out the seam where you sew them to the skirt, so you won't close up the opening of the pocket. Then sew the pocket opening closed, leaving 14 centimeters at the top of the pocket, so enclosing the rest of the bottom of the pocket. This was the point where I overlocked the curved and bottom edges of the pocket, but it's much easier to do it beforehand, so please make it in that way. Then to be able to attach the skirt to the bodice, we have to gather the skirt, so I marked the 7 centimeters at both ends of the skirt, just like at the bodice, to leave out for the buttonhole and the button plackets. And then I made 2 rows of gathering stitches, one before the 1 centimeter seam allowance and one after. And I did this by setting my stitch length to the biggest possible setting and just sewing a normal straight stitch all along the edge of the skirt. Then I grabbed the top threads of my gathering stitches and gathered up the skirt roughly to the size of my bodice, paying attention to the seams I have to match up. So here you can see I matched up the side seam of the skirt and the bodice, and then I gathered it as much as I needed for them to fit together. Then I pinned the whole thing together and sewed them with a normal straight stitch at the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then I overlocked the whole edge, but you can do a zigzag stitch instead. After this I hemmed the skirt by overlocking the whole bottom edge of the skirt because I didn't really want to use any length, so I overlocked the whole edge, and then I just folded it up by pressing it with the iron and going all along the edge, and then I sewed it close to the overlocked edge of the fabric. After this it was time to finish up the buttonhole and button plackets. I went to the top of the bodice and started to fold up the 7 centimeters of fabric by folding in 1 centimeter and pinning it all the way down to the edge of the skirt. I sometimes folded the top of the bodice down to the parts that I already folded to check that I'm still folding up the right amount of fabric. I did this on both sides and then I sewed it down with a normal straight stitch. The next to last step was to finish up the end of the sleeve. First I tried on the whole dress to determine the length I want for the sleeve, and I saw that I have quite a few centimeters surplus on the end of the sleeve, so I made a measurement and cut it down, and from this leftover fabric I made a longer strip of fabric I was going to use as bias binding to end the sleeve and to have a cute keyhole detail on the sleeve, and some ties I can tie into a cute bow to close up this keyhole detail. I made this fabric stripe so it would fit my bias binding maker, so I measured the width that I needed, I cut, and then you have to iron this together by folding it in half and then folding in the edges to this middle section. Then I also needed some bias binding that I cut on the bias so it would be able to fit around the keyhole detail. I used some leftover fabric for this as well. I measured that out, the width I need for my bias binding maker, and then I marked and cut it out. By the way, my finished bias bindings were around 1 centimeter wide, so you would need an around 4 centimeter wide fabric for that. Again, folding it in half and then folding the edges to the middle mark. You will have to do this by pressing it with an iron. Then for the keyhole, I measured around 5 centimeters from the top edge of my sleeve, so the line where my shoulder will be at, and to the front of the dress. Then I made a line of around 7 centimeters and I made 1 centimeter diagonal lines so after cutting it would be able to lay out flat. as you can see in the video. Then I grabbed my real bias binding, and with right sides together I pinned it to the keyhole opening by matching up one of the edges to the edge of the keyhole and pinning it in the crease of the first fold. Then I sewed along in this crease, paying attention that I grab a little bit of material on the cut up top of the keyhole detail. Then, because I didn't want to see the bias binding on this part of the sleeve, I folded the other edge to the middle of the bias binding and then folded the whole thing over to the wrong side of the sleeve, making the bias binding invisible from the right side of the fabric. And then I pinned it and sewed it along the bottom edge of the bias binding. I've cut away the surplus, and then I made 2 lines of gathering stitches just as I did at the skirt, and I started to pull on the top threads of the gathering stitches, gathering up the sleeve as much as I wanted to. I checked how much I want to gather it by pulling it on my arm, and when I was satisfied, I took the longer bias binding and I matched the center of the bias binding to the center of the gathered up sleeve and started to pin it right sides together, lining up the edges and pinning it and sewing it in the crease. After sewing, I trimmed down the seam allowance to reduce the bulk of the finished sleeve end. For this, I wanted it to be a visible bias binding, so I folded the other edge to the center and then I folded it over, enclosing the raw edges of the sleeve, and I paid attention that it overlaps the first stitch that I made in the crease of the bias binding, and then I pinned the whole thing down. After the sleeve edge, I pinned it also together, and at the ends I used another Instagram hack and I folded out the end of the bias binding, folded it about 1 centimeter, and then I tucked one edge into the other, as you can see on the video. Then I sewed it all along the right side of the material close to the first seam that I made, and finishing this whole thing with a top stitch. This is the final result and I'm really happy with it. I think this is a really cute detail and I will definitely use it on other garments too. And for the last step, I made the buttonholes and buttons, and I have a whole separate video on how I did this that you can check out in the description below, and I will link it in the corner as well. I describe in detail how to sew buttonholes and buttons with a sewing machine in that video, and I also show you how I place my buttonholes and buttons on this dress. My only additional information is that on this dress I tried out a new button placement method that I heard, and what I heard is that on high-end clothing the buttons are not placed in the center of the buttonholes, but they are spreading out at the top of the garment. They are placed in the top of the buttonhole, and as we go down the buttons are traveling down in the buttonholes as well. And it turned out pretty good, so you can give it a try. Okay, so after sewing all the buttonholes and buttons, we are ready, and now you can see the final result. I really enjoyed making this dress and I really love how it turned out. I love the details, especially the cute bow on the sleeve, so I really recommend that you give it a try. It's a really comfortable wear for spring and summer too. This was how I made this cute button-up dress, and please give a like if you liked my video and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on my next videos. Thank you so much for watching this video so far, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!